Yes, the U.S. has become an oligarchy. As an academic, I am very afraid that there will be suppression of academic freedom. It's already going on in Florida. When things are working well, people say, well, things are working well. I don't have to do anything. Because they do nothing, the powerful take over, they take control, and then they say, well, what can I do? I'm not powerful. And that's the end of democracy.
Welcome to the Greenletter Club, the channel that breaks down the big ecological issues. Today we are talking about the decline of freedom on the planet, oligarchy in the US, populism on the rise in Europe, privatization of media and social networks. Freedoms are contracting all over the world, hence the question, is neoliberalism destroying freedom, democracy and the planet? To answer this question, we are honored to welcome Joseph Stiglitz, professor of economics at Columbia University, winner of the Nobel Prize in economics in 2001, former White House advisor to Bill Clinton and author of The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society.
Thank you very much, Joseph, to come here in Paris. First question, the richest men in the world are controlling powerful social networks, are going to govern with billionaire president who has tried to overthrow power through a coup d'etat. Are the United States still a democracy, or are they become an oligarchy?
It's very clear we're an oligarchy. We are also an imperfect democracy. Probably most democracies are imperfect. We've always been imperfect. But unfortunately, rather than going into the direction of becoming a more perfect democracy, we're going in the opposite direction. If you think of our history, at the beginning, the only people who could vote were wealthy men who were white. A small fraction of the population. Now, in principle, all Americans have the right to vote, but there is systematic attempt by the Republicans to engage in voter suppression and through a whole variety of means to make some people's voice and vote count more than others.
Are you personally afraid for yourself, for your family, for intellectuals, as Donald Trump going for president in a few days?
So far, I am not personally very afraid, but as an academic, I am very afraid that there will be one form or another of suppression of academic freedom. It's already going on in Florida. It's going on in a whole variety of places where governments are trying to restrict in public textbooks discussions of climate change, evolution, what really happened in America's history, history of slavery and oppression. That's already going on.
Can you take examples?
Well, there are several states where the discussion in the science books of climate change is cut out. You cannot teach it. There are many places where discussions of the history of racial oppression, from segregation, and the struggle for freedom, more freedom by African Americans, is limited at best. And interpretations of this as oppression are not allowed.
In your book, you say that liberty is in decline all over the world, not only in the US. How far freedom is declining around the world?
Well, I think the reason that there is such a decline in freedoms in so many places is that the model, economic model, called neoliberalism, which gave some people freedom, but it gave them the freedom to exploit others, has not worked. And the result of that is we've had slower economic growth. What growth that has occurred has gone disproportionately to those at the top. There's been stagnation in the middle, decline at the bottom. And there's a widespread feeling that the system does not work. The elites who promised them that everybody would be better off are being discredited. And people are looking for, or you might say, demanding an alternative. When I wrote my book, The Price of Inequality, I said, this is creating a fertile field for a demagogue. And I also pointed out that there was a large potential supply of demagogues. I didn't anticipate how bad America's demagogue would turn out to be.
It was 10 years back, something like that?
2012. So it was 12 years ago. The article that it was based on was published in 2011, called Of the 1%, For the 1%, By the 1%.
Is inequalities the fuel of populism?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I think when it is of the magnitude of what we see here, and when it is the result of exploitation. It's one thing for somebody to become rich by innovating, creating something. It's another thing for somebody to get rich by exploiting somebody else, whether that exploitation is monopoly power, or as in the case of the one very rich American family, pushing drugs, opioids, leading to an epidemic of opioid and other drug deaths.
That's very interesting because in the 1890s, the US government passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law designed to break up monopolies and prevent companies to become too powerful. Are we reliving a similar period?
Yes, but I think in a much worse way. When we have monopolies of steel, or like Carnegie, or oil, Rockefeller, or tobacco, that's bad. But when you have monopolies over the means by which we communicate, that gives the private entrepreneurs the power to shape us, to shape our minds, to shape our beliefs. It's much more powerful. It was written about in these famous books, 1984, Animal Farms, where government was using, you might say, propaganda to shape us. But now we've privatized propaganda. We have the private sector having the ability to pollute our information ecosystem with mis and disinformation, and they've done it on a scale that is unbelievable.
What are the root causes of populism over the world? What are the links with neoliberalism?
The links with of this authoritarian populism with neoliberalism economic policies is very simple, and it's related to the ideas that I've just described. Neoliberalism gave freedom of the corporations to exploit others. A major theme in my book is the freedom of one is the unfreedom of others. I quote Isaiah Berlin, in effect saying, freedom of the wolves is death for the sheep. We've given freedom for the wolves, freedom for the corporations, and that has meant not death, but despair of ordinary individuals. They become billionaires at the expense of ordinary Americans. And that, or in an expected way, has given rise to resentment, anger, and the disparity between the promises and the reality have led to distrust of those who made the promises. 1966, the political elites, including the political elites of the establishment parties, Democrat and Republican, that made those promises, they've turned against them. In the Republican Party, Trump has basically a 180-degree departure from traditional Republicans. So he's captured the Republican Party. But people see very clearly that he is not a conventional Republican. The conventional Republicans were about globalists. They were about free trade. He stands for absolutely the opposite. He's a nationalist, which is one historical strand in the Republican Party, but it's not the dominant strand since World War II. And so in that sense, the Republican Party is going back to its pre-war roots.
There is an idea in your book which I felt very interesting, is that contrary to popular belief, you say that authoritarian regimes are born in states where governments do too little, not in those that do too much. Am I correct?
That's right. And I would just point out that the growth of this authoritarian populism is greater in a country like the United States because people feel cheated. They feel something is wrong. In countries where there is less inequality, government is providing services, education, health services, adequate retirement, there's a sense of well-being, and there's not this anger that we have. You know, we often look at income statistics, say GDP, say U.S. is a very high GDP. But what people really care about is standards of living, well-being. And all the surveys of well-being, U.S. is at the bottom. And one real indicator of well-being is life expectancy. If you don't live, you're not, you can't have well-being.
Yeah, it's almost collapsing in the U.S.
And the U.S. is lower than in any other major advanced country. It's declining, and there are the largest disparities in life expectancies between those who are rich enough to get the wonderful care that we can provide at the top and the actual care that those at the bottom receive.
We often talk about oligarchs in Russia. Can we talk about oligarchs in the US, in France, wealthy billionaires that are very close to the power? And there is another interesting idea, is that usually they make business with the states. For instance, Elon Musk with Tesla and SpaceX receive a lot of money, but lots of billionaires benefit from the federal state.
Yes, the U.S. has become an oligarchy. And what you said is absolutely right. But there's a twist for the U.S. The oligarchs in the U.S. often talk about libertarianism. They talk about a small government, but they don't mention how much they get from the government. So in the case of Elon Musk, Tesla has survived because of an almost $500 million loan from the federal government, where the government basically didn't take the upside. If they had taken the upside, in other words, said, if Tesla recovers, we want to get some shares, Elon Musk would not be so wealthy and the U.S. government would be much wealthier. But as you say, SpaceX gets billions of dollars from the U.S. government and a lot of money from other governments as well. So yes, this oligarchy is now very strongly established, and because it controls an important part of the media, the social media, Twitter, X, it gets to shape how very large portions of the population think about them.
There is also, you say that the concept of freedom have been somehow captured. All forms of regulation are now seen as punitive. How did neoliberalism manage to hijack the concept of freedom?
Yeah, it is a real story of you might say intellectual success that the very group that undermined the freedoms of so many people, gave freedom for the wolves to exploit the sheep, to kill the sheep, sold this idea of freedom. I think part of this you have to look particularly in the American context, where the American Revolution against Great Britain, getting U.S. freedom from colonialism, was described as a revolution for freedom. You see this looking back into our glorious past as about freedom. Give me death or give me freedom. But scholars more recently have reinterpreted this history. They now realize it wasn't about freedom, because most Americans in the South were slaves, and they were not given their freedom. If it was about freedom, it would have been the end of slavery. If it was about democracy, it would be giving votes to more people than just white, rich males. So it was, in some sense, little more than changing which elites would govern the North American colonies, whether it was elites from Westminster in England or elites within the colonies. So it was a change in political control from one elite to another elite, but not about freedom. But they seized that history, and that's why you see in the Republican Party the most extreme people calling themselves the Freedom Caucus, without understanding deeply what freedom meant and how we have to balance these freedoms. And one of the reasons for my writing the book was I wanted to recapture the freedom agenda for the left and say, let's think more deeply about what we mean by freedom, how we get freedom, and realize that the progressive agenda, the agenda of the left, is going to succeed in giving more freedom to more people.
Yeah, there is something interesting. There is a French philosopher recently who wrote a book and said there is a liberal sense of freedom, which is no frontiers, no barriers, nothing to prevent you from doing something. And there is a more left-wing way of thinking freedom, which is to get people autonomous. Do you share this?
Yes, the way I put it is a little bit narrower than the French philosopher, more like an economist puts it. Freedom is about freedom to choose. You might say agency, which is what the French philosopher was talking about, but it's the scope of what you can choose as well. So if you are at the point of starvation, you do what you have to do to survive. You have no freedom. Somebody might say, well, you have the freedom to starve yourself to death in one way or another way. But for the individual who is about to die, one way of starving and another way of starving are equivalent. What I care about a lot is the ability of people to live up to their potential. You might say the freedom to live up to your potential. And I want to increase that to the extent possible. And I also emphasize that whenever you talk about the restraints, as European liberals talk about, they are ignoring how one person's actions affects another's. So they're looking at it only from one side of the coin. So the freedom of corporations to pollute the atmosphere is taking away the freedom of others to have a life. If you have asthma and they're polluting with sulfur dioxide, somebody's going to die. So giving one person more scope is reducing another person's scope of living. And then I say, society has to make a judgment. We live together. And which is more important, the freedom to pollute or the freedom to live? And to me, the answer is obvious, that the freedom to live is more important than the corporation's freedom to pollute.
Is that what's happening with the climate crisis? You start talking about that. To sum up, billionaires to go in space or in the atmosphere just for tourism leads to people dies in floods, in fires. That's what we are currently seeing?
We are seeing that very currently. The wildfires in Los Angeles are killing people, destroying property, the result of climate change, global warming, to which putting up people in space, which has no social benefit, spending untold money for a joyride, is a good example of how the freedom of one is taking away the freedom of others.
I don't know if you're familiar with that history fact, but on the 20th February 1933, 24 powerful German CEOs like Krupp, Opel, Siemens were received by Hitler, who just become chancellor a month earlier. And they were urged to finance the Nazis' party campaign for the parliamentary election, and they complied. Today in France, many business leaders prefer rather see the far right come to power than the left. What does this mean to you? Like business leaders lead to the far right?
We have the same thing in the United States. The magnitude of the contributions to Donald Trump from Elon Musk, the magnitude of the contributions to Trump's inauguration, $250 million have been given, $250 million have been given for the inauguration, an unheard of amount. It's a kind of genuflecting that has been going on. Even more disturbing to me is not only the campaign contributions, but their willingness to back off from the kinds of commitments to social responsibility that they've made. People like Larry Fink at BlackRock have led to drop out of the climate action committees, and companies have abandoned their DEI, the diversity efforts to increase in equality and inclusiveness. These are fundamental values of our society, and before Donald Trump, they paid lip service to them. Some of us have said, oh, we have a new era of responsible business people. Many of us were skeptical. We said, this is PR, public relations. And unfortunately, it turns out to be the case. The moment it turned out to be politically inconvenient to be good, they changed the direction. I think, unfortunately, it will tarnish in a permanent or at least a long-term way the business leaders we're talking about. And that itself will lead to greater polarization in our society.
There is another very interesting idea in the book. I think you quote a British poet who once said, "No man is an island." The mistake of many economists is to think the freedom only in an individual way.
Absolutely. That was the point I was trying to make, that European liberals often think about the constraints that are posed on one individual, but they don't think about that systemically, that no man is an island, and the constraints you put or don't put on one person can affect others. One of the motivations of my book was the debate in the United States during the pandemic about masking and vaccines. People on the right said, making me take a vaccine or mask or social distance was taking away my freedom. My response is, if you don't do those things, COVID-19 spreads, and at that time it was very virulent. You're taking away other people's lives, or the right not to be in a hospital, not to be in a world of fear. And so in a closed society where we interact, the freedom of one was taking away the freedom of others. The other thing in America that we have all the time is the freedom to carry an AK-47. And you look at that and you say, well, that has taken away the freedom from fear. Every day, every parent in schools worry about, will their children come home because there's a mass murder? Which is more important, the freedom to carry an AK-47 or the freedom to live, for these children to be and their parents to be free from fear? They don't have to go training what to do when a gunman comes into your classroom, how you climb underneath the desk. We used to have nuclear drills for nuclear bombing when I was in school. Now we've gone into our schools drills for what happens when an AK-47 comes into your classroom. It makes every child live in fear. So to me, we live in a society where these freedoms have to be balanced. And in these cases, the balancing, I believe, is easy.
You also say that liberals see taxation as a deprivation of liberty. Taxation can let people freer, or is it a deprivation of liberty?
Well, it's another example where you have to balance and go back to my definition of freedom, the scope of what you can do. Let me illustrate, again, with the story of the pandemic that seems so long ago, but it was only 5 years ago, less than 5 years ago. We wouldn't be here talking if we hadn't had the vaccine, that COVID-19 vaccine that was so effective was based on the mRNA platform. That mRNA platform was financed by government. The transition from that platform to a vaccine that actually worked was almost totally financed by government. But if government is going to finance that, it has to get money, and that means taxes. So you ask the question, how do you weigh the slight constraint in spending that the taxes reflect versus the right to live? The vaccine gave you the right to live, or the right not to be in a hospital, not to worry. Well, again, it was very clear. That was money well spent. And even the richest person would say it's worth the right to live to pay a part of my income to the government.
Do you believe there was a parallel between the declining of individual freedom and declining of states' freedom in the world? Is the globalization reduce the freedom of states in the world?
I think there is a parallel in my book. I try to bring out that parallel. We talk about sovereignty, but we have to constrain. That's what international law is about. One of the reasons we have international law, I wish we could enforce it more, is that it constrains the wolves. Donald Trump has raised the question whether he will invade Greenland. So Denmark and Greenland now face the risk that there could be an invasion. Most of us say, oh, that couldn't happen. Couldn't happen. International law doesn't allow it. But Donald Trump doesn't believe in international law. So my belief, and I think most other people would say, we have to constrain Donald Trump. We have to constrain. We don't want to live in a world of the jungle where one person's freedom can really interfere with that of others. And similar issues arise in the context of trade. A very ugly episode of this occurred almost 200 years ago now, the Opium War. The West said, we have the right, said to China, we have the right to sell you opium. China said, no, we don't want our people to be addicts. And the West said, we will go to war to make sure that we are free to sell you opium. It's very clear to me that that freedom deprived China of its fundamental freedom. Today we wouldn't do it. We would say that's outrageous, but that was the reality. And if we look around, Donald Trump is trying to create that kind of world where the powerful dictate their terms, and international law means nothing.
You were part of Clinton's administration, and those leaders at that time, Clinton, Blair, Schroder, have been leaders that, in your opinion, have been corrupted by liberal ideas because they implement lots of laws, liberal laws in a way. At that time, liberal ideas were that strong that they've corrupted even the, let's say, left-wing side of politicians?
Yes. I would say there are important differences among the various leaders, but neoliberal ideas were just very pervasive, even among the center-left. Center-left wanted to say we're going beyond socialism in Europe. In America, we're going beyond the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. We're in a new world, and they wanted to show that they were modern. And so these ideas had a lot of influence among them. I would make some distinctions. I think there was an element in many of them of real corruption. Schroder wound up, after making Germany dependent on Russian gas, chairman of Gazprom.
The same occurs with Fillon, or a former prime minister.
Yeah. So that was corruption. It was the enticement of money. He put his country at risk. I wrote about that in one of my books, Making Globalization Work. I said it was absurd, it was foolish for Germany to get so dependent on Russian gas. And the consequences we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine. In the case of Clinton, he was ambivalent. We had an intense debate between people like Bob Reich, the Secretary of Labor, me on the one hand. We talked about corporate welfare. We said that we ought to have restraints, make sure we have a competitive market. We worried about lack of competition. So you had that side, and then you had the Robert Rubins, the Larry Summers, who were very much on the side of the corporations. Larry Summers advocated, for instance, lowering capital gains taxes, increasing inequality. So you had an active debate within the Clinton administration. Too often, the answer came down on the side of the corporations and on the rich. But at least in the Clinton administration, I think we had, during the first 4 years, a real debate on these issues.
Let's say that luckily I'm elected as French president tomorrow, and I invite you to give me some pieces of advices to get the people freer. What would be the first advices you will give to a president or a prime minister to get his people more freedom?
Oh, there are so many dimensions to freedom that is not a simple recipe. It's a broad agenda. We've been talking a little bit about the environment, climate change. Young people, if they are going to have freedom to live their lives, we have to do something about climate change. So you've seen the effect already, but the effect on them in 20, 30 years will be enormous. So one of the first things I would say is do something very strongly about climate change. Restrain pollution. And there are a whole variety of combinations of public investments, regulations, incentives through taxes that one can do to constrain climate change to enhance the freedom of young people to have the kind of future that they want. I think that one of the issues that is being debated in France is retirement. How do you have a good retirement? We are benefiting from advances in medicine that have extended our life expectancy and our ability to work. And that has affected the economic viability of the old pension systems. But at the same time, it has increased disparities in our society. Somebody who is a blue-collar worker who works physically every day, his life expectancy has not increased in the way that a professor like me, I can teach. I'm 81 going on 82, and I'm still teaching full time. I love it.
And the difference is very high. I don't have the right figures in mind, but it's like 10 years of difference. It's crazy.
In the US, more than that in life expectancy. So if you had the same pension system for everybody, same date, it's basically giving no pension for the blue-collar person and a very long pension for somebody who lives in a life without stress. That's not fair. So we have to recognize that a pension system that gives freedom of somebody to have a decent retirement, that important part of your freedom, has to be differentiated, has to be subtle, has to take into account the history of what they work at, their health. So it has to be, unfortunately, complicated. Not too complicated, it has to be understandable. And so that's the art. And I think from what I've seen, the proposals from the government have not reflected adequately the diversity of circumstances.
Well, people usually believe that the market is very efficient, whereas administration, governments are so inefficient. What you say is that that's not true. Market can be inefficient. And for instance, I was thinking about insurance that begin to refuse to insure some parts of the country because of fires, because of floods. Markets are not that efficient as we can think.
That's absolutely right. We did studies where you look at the percentage of money that goes to administrative costs in annuities. A pension is an annuity. We call it different words, but it's an annuity. And it takes a certain amount of money to administer an annuity. Government is so much more efficient than the private sector. Understandably, the private sector engages in advertising and sales. The government doesn't have to do that. But it is, the bottom line is, administrative costs are a fraction in government programs that they are in private. You look at another example. France has basically a public health system, which is more efficient. France's public health or America's private healthcare system. No question who wins. The cost in terms of percentage of GDP of France providing healthcare are half of what, just a little over half of the United States. And the outcomes are better. And the cost of Singapore providing public health are half of France. So yes, there are some governments that are more efficient than others. There are some companies more efficient, but the public companies are more efficient than the private. You look at the way American private insurance companies treat individuals. If you really incorporate the total societal cost, how much time the ordinary American has to spend in trying to figure out, to deal with his private insurance company, that's a real cost. And it is, let me say very frankly, very, very ugly. So aggravating that we had the CEO assassinated of United Health. And when that happened, nobody likes the idea of assassination, but everybody in America understood the aggravation that brought that assassination about. So that's the reality. The private companies are not efficient. One of the confusion that Musk has is he may be good at making cars, not as good as the Chinese companies, but he's, you know, may be good at, but the public sector provides services. And that's a very different kind of production process. It's a human interface. And we've seen some of the human interface of Musk is not exactly ideal.
Well, one of the avenues you suggest in your book is a greater diversity of institutions, not just companies seeking for profit at any price. What would be the point of that?
The point that I call for a diversity of institutions is that not everything is well suited for for-profit companies, partly because of what I call imperfect and asymmetric information. And that's what I got the Nobel Prize on. And it means that in the provision of certain key services, the people receiving the services really don't know what have difficulty judging what they're getting. You go to a doctor because the doctor knows more than you do, and you're not quite sure whether he's giving you the right diagnosis. You don't want to feel that he's providing you services, because the more services he provides you, the more money he makes. You want him to be dedicated to your interest, not to profit maximization. Education. Donald Trump created Trump University. It excelled in one thing: exploitation. It didn't deliver any services. People went to Trump University, they paid money because they thought, here was a successful entrepreneur, maybe he is going to tell me the recipe for success. You look at the United States, one of the strengths of the United States is its education, higher education system. People go there from all over the world. There is not a single good for-profit university among the top universities. The not-for-profits are Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Princeton, Stanford. Then you have the state universities like Berkeley, but none of them are for-profit. So that's another example where we have very successful institutions that are not for profit. And final example I talk about, we are increasingly becoming a care economy. And you want people who provide care to have empathy. That should be their motivation, not exploitation, not profits. And you think about, would you trust a for-profit institution, a for-profit company, to take care of an elderly person suffering from dementia? They don't know how they're being treated. And I get worried when a Wall Street hedge fund buys an old age home. I ask myself, what do they know about caring for elderly people? Why are they doing it? And I have to believe and have a suspicion, because this is a group that you can really exploit.
That really happened in France, where elderly persons have been very violently treated because it was a wealthy corporation that bought the group. Leopold Kohl said, whenever something is wrong, something is too big, in the immense, everything collapses, even the good, for as will become increasingly clear, the world's one and only problem is not evil, but excessive size. Doesn't the world's disorder ultimately stem from a globalization that allows overly powerful multinationals, corporations, overly wealthy billionaires, overly influential social networks? The main problem is that the size of phenomena.
I think it's a critical problem. Historically, in our competition laws in the United States, we've dismissed size alone as the dominant aspect and says it's size relative to the market. I could be a small company but dominate an important market and still have market power. But there could be a large market, I could be very large, but a small fraction of a large market, I won't have that dominant position. So historically, in antitrust, it's size relative to the market. But there's a rethinking of that is very much along the lines of your quote, that size itself is important because the role it can play in our politics, not in the private market, but in our political discourse. And within the United States, that's this emphasis of saying that we have to worry about power, size, is called the neo-Brandeisian movement that recognizes that however you denote the market, if you have somebody who is a billionaire, multi-billionaire like Musk or Zuckerberg, they have enormous influence. Their size distorts our democracy.
Yeah, democracy, I've been thinking, invented in places where there were like 30, 40,000 inhabitants in Athens. And can we have a democracy in places where there are thousands of millions or billions of people? That's.
I think you can. We have to work very hard to get citizen engagement. Too often, when things are working well, people say, well, if things are working well, I don't have to do anything. And then because they do nothing, the powerful take over, they take control, and then they say, well, what can I do? I'm not powerful. And that's the end of democracy. So you have to have engagement of everyone. Now, right now, as I look at the United States, we have the engagement of certain groups. Those who want to deny women's reproductive rights are very engaged. The gun lobby, very engaged. Corporations who want to use government to enhance their profits, very engaged. So the problem is you have these causes, the special interest, very engaged, and the mass of people who are suffering from their special interest, not engaged. And for each one, they can say, I have no effect. But collectively, if they get together, they can counterbalance. And so that's really what civil society is about, trying to explain that idea and saying, if we are going to have our democracy work, we have to counter those who see the state as a mechanism of advancing their interest and recreate a state where the interest of everybody is what is being pursued.
Joseph Stiglitz, thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you today.
Nice talking to you.
Thank you.